Good day, and today we're going to talk about modernism and postmodernism in literature. So when does modernism in literature happen? It is an expression of the modern era. We look around 1901 to about 1945. It tends to revolve around the themes of individuality, the complete randomness of life, the mistrust of government and religion, and the disbelief in an absolute truth. Now, there are three thinkers who influenced the modern era and modern literature. Most probably they are Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud. Now, this is not to say that modern authors are not ardent evolutionists or Marxists or even practitioners of Freudian psychology. Rather, these thinkers simply fueled and framed the perspectives and debates that formulated so much modern art and literature. Now, today, Freud's specific theories are largely dismissed as unscientific. Still, these ideas had a profound influence on art and literature as much as on our common daily perceptions and conceptions of existence and reality. So let's start off by looking at some of the modernist authors. Gerard Manley Hopkins, born 1844 and died 1889, was a poet dwelling chiefly on his spiritual relations with God. His poetry only became recognized in 1918 when he became published in Robert Bridges' edition. Now, the late publication effectively made the difficulties of his work anticipate our modern poetry, and so he became a major influence on later writers. James Joyce, born 1882 and died 1941, was an Irish novelist, short story novel writer, poet, and playwright that was born in Dublin, Ireland. Joyce wrote several volumes in an autobiographical novel which follows his life from infancy to his first departure for Paris. Joyce subsequently wrote an unsuccessful play published in 1918 and furthermore a slight volume of verses. Now, these were amid the beginnings of his two great works to come, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. These both occupied the remainder of his life. Next, we can look at William Butler Yeats, born in 1885 and died in 1939. William Butler Yeats was one of the foremost figures of 20th century literature. In 1923, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for what the Nobel Committee described as inspired poetry, which in a highly artistic form gives expression to the spirit of a whole nation. Yeats was interested mainly in the likes of mysticism, spiritualism, occultism, and astrology. In 1916, Yeats quite suddenly decided that he didn't want to write pretty poems anymore. He wanted to write realistic poems, poems as urgent and as uncluttered as a newspaper article. He even wrote a poem about his decision called A Coat. So some characteristics of modernism in Yeats include demotic language, in other words, not poetic language, political subject matter, ugliness, and violence, where these are appropriate to the subject matter, no attempt to make everything aesthetically pleasing in a poeticized vision of loveliness. So when we look at his two types of poetry, you can see the contrast in the context, the way that the words are actually put out on paper, and in the topics, the subjects. His traditional poem, he wishes for the cloths of heaven. Had I the heavens embroidered cloths, enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light. I would spread the cloths under your feet, but I, being poor, have only my dreams. I've spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. And then a modernist Yeats poem, The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Another author in modernism is Virginia Woolf. During the interwar period, Woolf was a significant figure in the London Literary Society and a member of the Bloomsbury Group. Her most famous works include the novels Mrs. Dalloway of 1925, To the Lighthouse of 1927, and in 1928 she wrote Orlando, as well as the book-length essay A Room of One's Own in 1929, with its famous dictum, "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction." Now, postmodern literature is used to describe certain characteristics of post-World War II literature, relying heavily, for example, on fragmentation, paradox, and questionable narrators. Unifying features often coincide with Jean-Francois Lyotard's concept of the meta-narrative and little narrative. We also look at Jacques Derrida's concept of what a play is, and Jean Baudrillard's simulacra. For example, instead of the modernist quest for meaning in a chaotic world, the postmodern author eschews often playfully the possibility of meaning, and the postmodern novel is often a parody of this quest. So when we look at Jean-Francois Lyotard, his work is characterized by a persistent opposition to universals. He's fiercely critical of many of the universal claims of the Enlightenment, and several of his works serve to undermine the fundamental principles that generate these broad claims. Lyotard was a frequent writer on aesthetic matters. He was, despite his reputation as a postmodernist, a great promoter of modernist art. Lyotard saw postmodernism as a latent tendency within the thought throughout time and not a narrowly limited historical period. He favored startling and perplexing works of an avant-garde high modernist fashion. In them, he found a demonstration of the limits of our conceptuality, a valuable lesson for anyone too imbued with the Enlightenment confidence. Lyotard has written extensively also on a few contemporary artists of his choice: Valeria Adami, Daniel Buren, Marcel Duchamp, Bracha Ettinger, and Barnett Newman, as well as also touching on the subjects of Paul Cézanne and Wassily Kandinsky. Now, Kurt Vonnegut is also a well-known postmodernist author, with his works winning fame after they were published in 1969. The classic combines science fiction elements with an analysis on the human condition. Now, the novel is based on Kurt Vonnegut's own experience in World War II, and that novel, Slaughterhouse-Five, treats one of the most horrific massacres in European history, the firebombing of Dresden. Now, the author Kurt Vonnegut also wrote plays, essays, and short fiction, but it was his novels that became classics of the American counterculture, making him a literary idol, particularly to students in the 1960s and 70s. Dog-eared paperback copies of his books could be found in the back pockets of blue jeans and in dorm rooms on campuses throughout the United States. Kurt Vonnegut also used humor to tackle the basic questions of human existence. For example, Vonnegut might ask, why are we even in this world? Is there a presiding figure to make sense of all this, a God who, in the end, despite making people suffer, wishes them well? Now, in 1998, Mr. Vonnegut returned to a former World War II air raid shelter in Dresden, Germany, where he was a prisoner of war. His experience there was the basis for his novel Slaughterhouse-Five. Kurt Vonnegut not only wrote metaphysical themes, but with a blend of science fiction, philosophy, and jokes, he also wrote about the banalities of consumer culture, or even the destruction of our environment. Another one of our postmodernist authors is Ian McEwan. For example, Atonement by Ian McEwan employs several characteristics of postmodernism in its narrative techniques that foreground the conflict between differing perceptions of truth and the elusiveness of a person's memory. Now, Atonement questions not only the authorial authority, but also the consciousness of the mind. The mind can distort truth in history and ardently illustrates how easy it was to get everything wrong, completely wrong. Under the structure of the narrative foregrounds the conflict between the different perceptions of truth, facts, and beliefs, and the difference of truth and illusion, and it reflects on a smaller scale the similarly written, similarly constructed history of the Second World War. Another of our postmodernist authors is Louis de Bernières. Now, again, postmodernism is hard to define because it's a concept that appears in a wide variety of disciplines or areas of study. And we can count postmodernism in art, architecture, music, film, literature, sociology, communications, fashion, and even in technology. It's hard to locate it temporarily or historically because it's not clear exactly when postmodernism begins. So perhaps the easiest way to start thinking about postmodernism is by thinking about modernism. Go back to the beginning. For example, Louis de Bernières, who lives in Norfolk, published his first novel in 1990 and was selected by Granta magazine as one of the 20 best of the young British novelists of 1993. De Bernières' most famous book is his fourth, Captain Corelli's Mandolin, in which the hero is an Italian soldier who is part of the occupying force on a Greek island during the Second World War. In 2001, the book was turned into a film. De Bernières strongly disapproved of the film version, commenting, quote, "It would be impossible for a parent to be happy about its baby's ears being put on backwards." He does, however, state that it has its redeeming qualities, and particularly likes the soundtrack. Thank you so much for stopping by for a quick look at modernism and postmodernism. If you'd like me to cover some more about the authors or go back and find some specific novels to cover, let me know down in the comments who you would like me to cover from these two movements. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. Take care.